what is basic formal ontology and why are we using it?
I think before we answer that question, we just have to, I guess, remind ourselves that ontologies are structures that organize knowledge and the kind of entities that you might want to talk about in a given domain. Now, because there are many, many different domains, there are also many, many different ontologies, each one concerned with its own domain, like aspects of psychology in some ontologies, aspects of biology in some other ontologies. And it quickly becomes difficult to use these ontologies together unless they have some kind of organizing structure which says how they all can kind of relate to each other and sort of an overarching cross-domain structure. And this is what basic formal ontology is aiming to provide. So it's aiming to provide a so-called top-level or upper-level ontology, which is cross-domain, very small and simple, and just provides a structure which allows other ontologies to populate their domain-specific content underneath it.
Right. So basically, the reason we use it is because we want to make our ontology interoperable or compatible with other ontologies that might cover similar areas. And really, the only way we can do that is if we all have the same worldview at the very top level. So in a way, I see basic formal ontology as a sort of a way of thinking about the world in general, the universe, everything from all the way from atoms to stars and galaxies.
That's right. That's exactly it. I think the sort of philosophical foundations become clearer when you look at what is actually included in basic formal ontology. It's the sort of ways of thinking about the world and how we can categorize the things in the world in a general way, in a cross-domain way. The thing that I've noticed working in lots of ontology projects is that those ontologies that don't use an upper-level ontology invent an upper-level ontology. But they tend to invent different ones. And this is the challenge, right? If you're sort of slicing up your fundamental view of reality in different ways across different ontologies, then it's impossible to align sort of the rest of what you put in, because the very root is depending on different assumptions, different ways of looking at the world. And it happens easily kind of by accident.
The other thing I've noticed about using basic formal ontology is that in making sure that your classes are compatible with it, forces you to think about the world in a consistent way, which otherwise you wouldn't do. So Barry Smith and the people who put together basic formal ontology have done the work for us in terms of thinking out, well, what kind of things are there in the world and how do they relate to each other? And then what we have to do is to see how our specific things relate to that conceptualization of the world. Of course, it is just one conceptualization, and all ontologies, even realist ontologies as this is, are perspectives. They're not the world. They're a way that we represent the world, and there are different ways of doing it. But in my experience, it's a way that really works for pretty much everything that we do. So I think it's a really good discipline, and we're going to come to this later on in this training video. It's a really good discipline for people using any ontology to think, what kind of ontology class in basic formal ontology is this?
That's right. And I would add to that, I would say that the trouble is that very often when we're sort of deep in the water of a topic, we have ambiguity between basic ontological types, and we just fluidly move between them without paying that much attention. But unfortunately, it does actually make a difference, and the difference can pop up sort of down the line when you see that a concept has been used inconsistently. This is a kind of reflection of the fact that it was ambiguous all along.
And a classic example of this is the concept of addiction, where so many of the definitions of addiction are essentially incoherent because they're confusing things like addiction as a process, addiction as a characteristic of a person, addiction as a behavior pattern. They're all different things. And so if you don't set your stall out by saying, okay, what kind of thing are we talking about when we're talking about addiction in the sense that we want to use the term, then you're basically starting from a base that just is going to fold as soon as you try and do anything with it. With that in mind, then, I think this is a good point for us to talk about what are the key classes in Basic Formal Ontology, starting from the top. And so with Basic Formal Ontology, you have this thing called entity, which is basically anything you can imagine. Under entity, which is any construct or idea that you can come up with, immediately below that, we have two technical terms that BFO uses that you and I come to be very familiar with, but will be a bit weird to people. And there's a good reason why it uses technical terms rather than words that we're used to, because it doesn't mean exactly the same thing as those words that we're used to. So what do we have under entity?
So we have the two categories, continuant and occurrent, which basically reflect two fundamentally different ways of categorizing things in the world. And this distinction, it's very important in Basic Formal Ontology, but it comes up every time you try and ontologize anything. It's a distinction between types of entities that exist self-identically, so the same individual entity exists over a period of time, and those are continuants. And on the other hand, you have the sorts of things that we talk about which actually unfold in time. So they have parts which are happening at different times, and you only have the totality of the thing after some time has passed.
Yeah.
And so things that happen are occurrence, they occur, and things that continue to exist over time, they are continuants.
Let's now drill down under a continuance. What kind of things do we have under continuant?
So the biggest distinction beneath continuant is between objects which are sort of independent continuants which are sort of self-contained and stand alone, and those which are dependent. And dependent in this sense, it means ontological dependence. It doesn't mean sort of practical physical dependence. So, of course, humans depend on oxygen to stay alive, but that's not an ontological dependence. That's only a practical physical dependence. So the kind of ontological dependence we're talking about, for example, an exemplary of a dependent continuant is a quality, and a quality would be, for example, color. Now, a color cannot exist without it having something that it is the color of. It simply doesn't make any sense at all. You cannot talk about a pure color. It is a color of something. And that's ontological dependence.
So we have what they call independent continuant in the jargon, because it doesn't rely semantically on anything else. It can exist in itself, and that includes things like objects and so on. And then we have the dependent continuants, which are essentially things about those objects or about those independent. So you can't have a dependent continuant that isn't born by or whatever the term is, inhering in an independent continuant. So taking as an example, a person is an independent continuant, and their height is a dependent continuant.
Right. And it's the height of them, right?
Yeah.
It's the height of the person.
You can't have height without something having the height, as it
Yeah,
were.
exactly.
And you mentioned, of course, objects, which are one of the kind of independent continuant. But actually, objects are a subclass also of another thing that is an independent continuant called a material entity. So,
Right.
and one of the things I like about BFO, which we had this discussion, years ago when we were first discussing this, and I was thinking, well, there's lots of things we want to talk about that aren't really objects, like water. Water's not an object, but it's a thing of some sort. It's obviously an independent continuant. Well, it's a material entity. It's not an object.
Right.
A glass of water is an object, but you can have water.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there are various maybe more subtle distinctions that can be made when we start to talk about classification of the types of things within independent continuants, right? But one of these foundational, really important distinctions between material and immaterial. And
Yes.
I think here it's of course very unintuitive to think of an immaterial entity as a continuant, but I think there are clear examples where it's fully where an entity is fully immaterial and nevertheless is a thing which we like to study or talk about. And I think some examples that may fit in there are, for example, the holes or cavities. In anatomical context, these are very important. Sites and such like. So sort of things to do, somehow they are very closely related and are manifested in a physical world, and they are continuants, they continue to exist, but they are not material.
Going on to the other side, or the other side of the continuant class, we've got these dependent continuants. And this is an area, I think, where people can get quite confused. And again, there's jargon. Specifically dependent continuants, tell me what they are.
Yeah. So here, okay, we've sort of covered the idea that a dependent continuant is something that ontologically sort of depends on something else in order to exist, right? So color is the color of something, height is the height of something. Both of those are examples of specifically dependent continuants. Because you cannot, it doesn't even make sense to think about it, transfer them from one continuant, independent continuant to another. It doesn't make any sense to talk about that. One apple is red, another apple is red, but they both have their own red. However, generically dependent continuants, they can actually be moved between hosts, so to speak, or between independent continuants that they are attributes of. And there are not many sort of types of entity that behave in this way. One of the sort of main reasons for having this branch of BFO is to deal with the nature of information. Information can be copied from one bearer to another. It definitely depends on a bearer, but can be moved or copied.
If I talk about a study report, right?
Yeah.
Now, the study report can exist on lots of computers in electronic form. It can exist as paper. It can exist. You could have it as a semaphore if you like. So, because what's the key thing about the study report is the information that
Exactly.
it contains. That the fact that it's on paper or in electronic form or someone's reading it aloud or whatever it might be is neither here nor there. It's the information that's the key.
Yes.
And that makes it a generically dependent continuant. And so we have this under generically dependent continuant in the BCIO. We use this a lot because underneath that is a thing called an information content entity.
Yeah.
And that is things like reports, documents, and so on. And then
That's right.
under that is something which we all have ultimately to use, which is called a data item. So
That's
could you
right.
just tell us a bit about data items?
So a data item is in a way a unit of information that you want to capture in a sort of database, I guess, or in some study where you are capturing data. Typically a data item it will be bound to some or other format. Like it might be you're trying to catch a number or you're trying to capture a string or a code of some sort. So these are all the things to think about when you're defining a data item. And they are indeed very important in research because we use data for research, right? In empirical research. One thing which you didn't mention, Robert, was that an information content entity may be about something.
Yes. Right.
And this is the fundamental relationship of information to the things that it could be describing or could be representing. So, of course, an ontology itself as a document, which is digitally enabled, it is also an information content entity, and the representation of the classes are exactly this kind of representation. So it can get quite confusing to think about, we're creating a representational structure, and then sometimes we need to talk about other representational structures inside our representational structure.
I personally struggle quite often with deciding whether some class that I want to annotate or construct is a data item, or is it the thing that is the data item about? And there are a few kind of rules of thumb to help us decide that. And one of them, if it's got units of measurement, it's a data item. So if it's feet,
That's
inches, anything like that, it doesn't matter what else you've got, it's a data item.
That's right, because then you're really talking about something in a specific format, right? So you're not, if you're talking about the thing in the world, then you could measure that in 3 different ways.
Right.
But that would lead to 3 different data items.
So if you have something like alcohol consumption, well, alcohol consumption is an occurrent. It's actually an occurrent called, which is more specifically a process. If someone is in the process of consuming alcohol, but if we want to measure the amount of alcohol consumed, there will be an amount, that's a thing, but whatever we come up with in terms of a number, litres, pints, milliliters, whatever, quarts, gills, they will have to be data items, and they will be about the amount of alcohol consumed. Can we cross over now back to specifically dependent continuants, because there's a number of these that we use a lot in BCIO. Yeah. We've talked about qualities, and can you just briefly run over again what qualities are?
Yeah, so qualities are the kinds of attributes so you can use the word attribute as a sort of umbrella for all dependent continuants that inhere in an entity. And qualities are those kind of attributes that are very intrinsically tied up with the constitution of the material entity, right? So things like color, weight, height, you cannot have a change in those types of attributes without also changing something physical in your object or your material entity. And I think this is important, it sort of intuitively captures the essence of sort of properties of material entities. There are qualities. But we can contrast them with 2 other important types of dependent continuant. You have what's called a disposition. And a disposition is a really interesting sort of thing because it's kind of a potentiality. It's not a property which is manifested in full right now, like color is, it's a potentiality. So a canonical example would be the fragility of a glass. Glass doesn't seem to have the property of fragility. If you didn't know, you would think, well, this is a pretty solid thing, right? But under the right circumstances, it will shatter. And this is this property of fragility, which is a disposition. So a disposition is the kind of thing that's realized if the right circumstances come about. It's a potentiality for something that could happen under the right circumstances, which is, of course, still somehow physically grounded, but it's physically grounded in a different way. The third main category of dependent continuant, which is what's called roles, these are externally grounded. And what that means is you can have a change in the role without any change having happened to the entity itself. And these are typically social, because you sort of ascribe a role to something. You hold it in that way. And the type, examples which are relevant for behavioral science would be maybe professions or jobs which people hold for a while and then they don't hold them anymore. And it doesn't mean that something has physically changed in the person. They just don't have that job role anymore.
So a quality, using the jargon, is something which is kind of like, if it's true of something, it's always true of it. It's kind of like, you are a given height. It's always sitting there, your height, you are being that height. Whereas a disposition and a role, which are both examples of what they call in BFO realizable entities, because they're only realized realized in the sense of made real.
Yeah.
Under certain circumstances.
That's right.
So disposition is a realizable attribute that happens under certain where it becomes real under certain circumstances. You drop the glass and you find out how fragile it is. If it's made of plastic, it's fine. And if it's made of cut glass, it'll probably shatter. And an example of that for humans would be something like intelligence or cognitive ability or personality or addiction. We use these a lot in BCIO because so much of what we want to talk about when we're talking about people are things that are not happening all the time, but there's something about them that makes them respond in different ways to events as they occur. And that's what personality does. But the role, which we also talk about a lot in BCIO because it's really important, is realized by your relationship with the outside world. And the key thing, I think, for people to note here, that the word role here is being used in a technical way. It's not just your personal role as a bus driver or whatever. It's the role. Anything can have a role potentially as something. And an example of that, which is incredibly important and a very useful distinction when talking about chemicals, is the drug role.
That's right.
Drugs. So you take something like antidepressant, right, or cholinergic agonist or whatever. Those are not and shouldn't be classified as types of chemical, because chemicals can have multiple roles and those roles can change. They exist by virtue of their relationship with purposes to which the drugs might be put or how they operate on the body. So when we're talking about research, for example, researcher, study participant, statistician, and so on, these are all roles. They're not types of people. Now we move over to the occurrent side, and there's a number of high-level classes there that we want to talk about, but probably the first one to talk about is the one called process, which we, again, use an awful lot in BCIO. What are processes?
So processes are happenings, things that unfold in time, that have a beginning and an end, that during which some change takes place, during which something happens. There's not much more to be said about processes, in the sense that this is a quite broad category, and many different types of occurrent would be classified as processes.
So for us, examples of processes are things like chemical reaction, that's a process. Behavior is a process, it unfolds over time. Thinking is a process. And we have process parts. So a process could be a part of another process, obviously. So something that you do in part of an intervention could be part of the process that is the larger intervention. And again, one of the things I think people really struggle with and it's so easy to get wrong in ontologies is this difference between the subclass concept, something is a subclass of something else, and something is a part of something else. So a particular behavior change technique that is being deployed in an intervention is a process part. It's not a subclass of an intervention, it's a part of an intervention.
It can get confusing, but I think a good rule of thumb when thinking about this question of whether something is a part of or the whole, a subtype of, is to ask yourself whether every attribute that's true of the parent is also true of the child, right? And if you think about it, like you can do this in anatomy. You can ask yourself, well, a hand is a part of a human, but there are certainly, you wouldn't classify a hand as a type of human, right? I mean, nobody would intuitively do this, but if they were trying to do that, then you could sort of point out to them that the human as a whole had, other attributes or different attributes. And I think when it comes to processes, it's more difficult to think through those types of thought processes. So you could ask yourself, okay, there's an intervention as a whole, which has lots of parts, but some of those parts will have a much shorter duration, or they will not contain the full scope of different types of things that appear in the full intervention, and you have to kind of think through those consequences.
Does a process have to continue over time from the beginning to the end, or can it be interrupted and still count as the same process?
I think it can be interrupted and still count as the same.
So you can have interrupted processes, because a lot of let's say I'm making a decision. I'm not sitting there making the decision the whole time. I keep coming back to it and so on. But we want to call that a process, even though it's not happening, throughout the whole period. And so, if someone's smoking a cigarette, for example, they might put the cigarette down. They're not constantly puffing on the cigarette. So they might put it down and then pick it up again and do something else. So, but we still want to call that a smoking a cigarette process, I think. Is that right? Exactly.
So processes don't have to be kind of entirely connected. They don't have to be fully connected, right? You would have a subtype of processes, which would be a fully connected process, right? Which is one that doesn't have any gaps or breaks in it with respect to time. But that would just be one subtype of process.
To recap, we've covered a lot of the main classes within Basic Formal Ontology and explored how these relate to the Behaviour Change Intervention Ontology. And we've said that entities are anything that you can think of in the world, and those can be divided into two kinds in Basic Formal Ontology of entity, and that's continuants, which are things which exist in time, such as objects and materials, and things that occur over time, which we call occurrence. And then within continuants, we have what we call independent continuants. These are things that have an existence in and of themselves, which includes material entities such as water or blood, and objects such as people, and immaterial entities, which includes things like gaps or holes, for example. And then we have dependent continuants, which only exist as characteristics in some way of something, or have some dependence semantically and ontologically on something else. And we divide these up into specifically dependent continuants, which are characteristics such as height and so on, which we call qualities, and what we call realizable entities, which are things which become manifest at particular times, on particular occasions, under particular circumstances. And under these, we have dispositions such as personality, addictedness, cognitive ability, and so on. And we have roles which become manifest in relation to things around the object, or the thing that has that characteristic, such as profession, for example. And then we also have generically dependent continuants, which aren't tied to a specific object or material entity, but can be expressed across multiple such entities. And that includes things like information. We have the class information content entity, which includes things like documents, protocols, databases, and so on. And then under that, we have data items, which are very specific pieces of information. And any time when you're talking about a measurement of something which has units of measurement, then it'll be a data item. And then with occurrence, we focused on processes, which are things that happen over time, involve some kind of sort of change, and that includes things like behaviours and interventions. So that's it. There's a lot to take in, and this last slide is worth keeping in mind and making a note of. And it would be probably a good idea to think about some of the things that you talk about in your papers and in your work, and see what kind of a BFO entity it is. So it might be an idea to pause the video at this point and go through a paper or some document of yours and see if you can identify for each of the key terms that you've got in that document what kind of a thing it is in relation to BFO.